shawty, fell of the ball, she's got that 40. Hold me, lift me in the air and throw me. Hold me, if you got a package, show me. Roll me, that's a lot of baggage you hold it. Leave it by the trash, give a stack this morning. Roll me, all up on the land with the homie. And I give a head, cause I know he'll blow me. Roll me, 50 gloves like a Snoop, while you do me doggy style. 50 gloves like a booty grooving to the outer wild. Oh, we out and out of wild, smoking on some wild ground weed on the scene. Get drinking, making loud sounds, waking up the whole town, pulling up the ghost town, turning up the whole sound, shoving down the ground round. Habanero ketchup, fucking got me messed up. She on top, but she's still my shawty. Fell of the ball, when she's got that 40. Hold me, let me in the air and throw me. Hold me, if you got a package, show me. Whoa me, that's a lot of baggage you hold it. Leave it by the trash, give a stack this morning. Roll me, all over the land with the homie. And I give a head, cause I know he'll blow.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to my super late night stream. This is a special stream dedicated to a purpose, and that purpose is to debut this new web novel that I've got called Sun Ops. It's Rookie the Renegade's Reckoning. That's the full title, or SO3R, as it will be abbreviated to. Hashtag SO3R. I know it's a bit much, a mouthful of a title. I got to watch the Young Clippa Legal Battle Fund go to 5K tonight. That was very nice. I need my buddy to get out of jail. I mean, he's not in jail right now, but I need to make sure he doesn't go back to jail. And the only way to ensure that that happens is to get him a good lawyer. And he needs a fund for that. So if anybody has anything to spare for a worthy legal fight, go on over to freeriley.fund. Otherwise, let's talk about furries. Aura Luna says, Trixie, I will have a finished furry anime part 2 document for you by the next stream, and that is a promise. I didn't have a chance to finish, but I plan to finish soon. Excellent. Aura Luna, of course, wrote, also known as That One Lucario Fan, wrote the furry anime that you should watch for Pride Month video over on the We Watch Anime channel, which is just the latest in my series of things you should watch, anime you should watch for Pride Month videos, of which I had the Yuri classics and the trans anime and manga videos before. Furhole Kabuki says, hello everyone, I'm a huge fur looking for a fun community to join. Hope you will have me. It'd be awesome. Rower. Nothing suspicious about that name or avatar. Nothing suspicious to me. I don't know. Oh yeah, this Mastodon shirt. It's actually a shirt from Mastodon State Park, which I assume is where Mastodon the band got their name because it's in Atlanta, Georgia, where they're from. Anyway. Some of y'all who watch these streams very regularly, you may remember that a few days ago, like a week ago or so, I told Bird I wanted him to write a book. And then I started interrogating him about what his book would be about if he wrote a book. And he made it clear that he wanted to compete with Harry Potter, that it had to be a young adult fiction book because he wanted it to sell. He wanted to make lots of money. So it had to be for young adults. And when he was describing the character and where they come from, it was clear he was just talking about himself. He was just describing, his own being a teenager, coming of age, basically revisiting his own coming of age, down in San Diego, but through the lens of like a story that would combine elements from stuff like K, Project Kings, which he's a huge fan of, Project K, or Jujutsu Kaisen, that he's also a big fan of, combining aspects of those stories, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, those influences, like epic shonen, combining that with the atmosphere and vibe of San Diego, and also a main character who fights with a longboard. This was very important. He had to be a longboarder, and he has to fight using his longboard. That's pretty much the gist of Bird's idea. So I've taken that and fleshed it out, basically adapting the story of how Bird was kicked out of his mom's apartment in real life. But imagining if things went differently after that, because he's a furry dog boy that gains magical powers in this story. So this is basically like, what if Bird was a furry dog boy that gets magical powers when he's 18 and gets completely involved in this world of magical fighting that's happening in San Diego, you know, instead of the way his life actually transpired. So I've got the first chapter of this. It's 16 pages long. Now, before I even get into this, Laputia is here saying she only has 30 minutes. If anybody wants me to read anything on this stream, this doesn't just have to be about my new furry web novel. I've got Manhunt here. What chapter are we on of this, Laputia? I don't even fucking remember. I think we read... Let's see. I know the last chapter ended with her listening to them fucking. It was a really fucked up chapter. Yeah, okay, that was chapter 7. So 8 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13. There's 13 pages in the next chapter, and it also ends the first part, after which we hit part 2 of 3. So the next chapter is the end of part 1, and it's 13 pages. This is Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin. Laputia has been paying me to read it in chapter by chapter. You can read that Manhunt aloud on YouTube. Oh, the great thing about literature is that as long as there's not any pictures, you can say whatever you want almost anywhere on the internet, except for a couple of choice words. And who can say those words depends on who they are. It just so happens I've got special permissions to use any of the slurs that Gretchen Felker Martin is capable of using. So I get to read this book on stream because I'm a trans woman. I don't know if anybody else could. I have not read this any further than what I have read on stream. I've owned it for a while, but I had not read, like 4 years, but I had not read past the first chapter until I was paid through the first 7 of them on previous streams. And the last one we read was fucked. It was very, very, very sad. Very, very disturbing. It was not a good time. It was not pleasant. It was... Actually, it was so unpleasant that it like shifted my bar for how unpleasant I even expected this book to get. All right, Lapucia's paying us into it. So, precursor to me debuting my own furry book, we're gonna go ahead and get my voice going with some Manhunt. Luckily, my book will not be anywhere near as sad as depressing as this. My book will be a walk in the park, literally a walk in the park compared to this. All right. Wait, this is the wrong chapter. That's 7. I need 8. 8. No, there we go. Sleepover. It was just before dawn when Fran woke. A light rain fell, barely a mist under the shelter of the oak's broad leaves. Robbie's bedroll was damp. He smelled like sweat and dirt and fresh-cut grass. Fran squirmed closer to him, relishing the feeling of his arms around her and the lingering frisson of his tongue sliding slick and muscular into her asshole. When he'd gone down on her, tonguing and kissing the stiff length and soft folds of the hateful thing she called her cunt, when she called it anything at all, holding her loose skin between his teeth and pressing his nose into the sticky hollows of her thighs where they met her pelvis. She'd had to stuff her fist into her mouth to keep from screaming. "What time is it?" he whispered. Fran pulled away, though not ungently. She hadn't known he was awake. "5-ish," she whispered back, sitting up and running her hands through her greasy, tangled hair. Birds sang. The woods looked ghostly, the highway a dirty memory in its silence. "We should get moving." Not far away, Beth slept with her back turned to them, hugging her knees chin tight against her chest. A single spot of blood darkened her bike shorts just over her anus. They came out of the woods behind a lumber yard on the edge of town. Fog hung over the tall grass. Insects rose in waves before them, the buzzing of their wings low and muted in the humid air. Fran had Beth's bow and quiver, along with the 3 arrows she'd recovered from the bodies of the men outside the house, and the extra weight kept throwing off her stride, the bow's lower arm smacking the back of her thigh as she adjusted the duffel strap repeatedly in a futile effort to get comfortable. Beth had insisted on walking, and already Fran saw bloodstains spreading on the back of her ratty olive leggings where her cuts were tearing open. She moved with a stiff, halting stride between piles of moldering 2x4s from which delicate blades of grass sprouted like arm hair. Robbie followed close behind, though the few times she'd glanced back at him, he'd looked sweaty and uncertain. All of yesterday's easy confidence melted away into the hazy, overcast morning. Now he just looked like a scruffy, skinny boy playing soldier. Beyond the lumberyard's burned-out offices and outbuildings, past its mossy porta-potties and the unreadable sign at the end of the dirt drive leading up from Sewall Street, lay a solid quarter-mile of scorched wasteland where the town council had torched everything flammable and bulldozed through the wreckage. Past that was the sprawl of Governor Weir Park, its neatly spaced oaks and maples lost among choking vines and new-growth saplings, the grass under their competing branches a sea of deep green waving in the sluggish breeze. The smell of salt blew through the desolation, tugging flakes of ash from the skeletons of immolated houses. They crossed Sewall, leaving the burn zone behind, and cut north around the park. Indy's place was on Main past the town library and the start of the downtown drag. Silent storefronts and barred windows, concrete barricades topped with barbed wire and broken glass. I just realized I should put something else on screen. Beth was limping as they passed through the unmanned checkpoint by a narrow channel between 2 of the repurposed traffic barriers. Fran matched her faltering pace until they were side by side. "You can lean on me," she whispered. Beth looked away, spots of color livid in her pale, hollowed cheeks. "I'm fine." Fran thought of the man coming over the ridge of the roof, of the way he'd crouched down low and shaken his hindquarters like a cat about to pounce. She thought of her voice caught frozen in her throat, and Beth tumbling over the gutters, tearing one of them loose with a flailing arm or leg so that it swung with a groan of twisting metal and pinched itself shut under its own weight. "I tried to warn you. Did I shout? Did I reach for you? Did your fingers slip through mine?" There was nothing but a tangle of adrenaline and fear and the sight of rotten teeth bared in excitement as the men closed over Beth, swarming and clawing with mindless insect intent. That had happened. That was what was real. Downtown was deserted. This early, everyone would be at the power plant or inland working on one of the town's farms. Seabrook didn't have much soil worth growing in, but there were a few strains of beans and sprouts that did all right, and one town over in Exeter was the sprawling pig and chicken outfit owned by a bunker brat, Sophie Whittle, whose billionaire parents had vanished on tea day and left her with an armed security detail, a vault full of non-perishables and potable water, and the perfect sprawling underground complex to house it all. The town had to treat her like something between a CEO and a feudal baroness, which was a better deal than you got with most brats. Fan had heard there was a Gates baby somewhere in the Connecticut who kept a big pit full of men in her bunker and fed them anyone who pissed her off, like Jabba the Hutt serving his dancers up raw to the stop-motion monster under his palace. In the parking lot of the gutted CVS, they passed a pair of black girls no older than 5 or 6 throwing a tennis ball for a gangly speckle-coated mutt. Fran smiled and waved. The taller of the two returned her gesture shyly while the other hid behind her. She wondered what it was like to be a kid in this world, to have no memory of the civilization that had come and gone before they had found motor control, to have no knowledge of men but the slavering, screeching face of T-Rex. We outlived every dad in the world. Lost in thought, she bumped into Beth's outstretched arm and nearly fell. Her indignant "huh" died in her tongue as she saw what waited for them in the square a few blocks into town. There was a flatbed with an awning parked in the street outside the town hall, the 3-foot XX daubed on its cab, livid in the sunrise. On the steps of the quaint white hall with its steeple and its sharp-pitched roof was a stern-looking white woman in a worn police uniform, mid-40s or a little older, and beside her, smoking a menthol and looking pissy, was a teenage girl wearing fatigues over an XX t-shirt, a rifle slung across her back. Someone had bolted huge storm warning sirens to the eaves of the town hall and the buildings around it. Fat loops of cable hung between them. The fuck is that? Follow me, said Beth. Her breathing sounded ragged. Her face was gaunt and bloodless. We'll go around. This feels like that start of Resident Evil 4. Indy's house was about a mile past the town hall, back toward the residential stress of Maine, where the ocean smell grew stronger and the distant booming of the surf murmured at the edge of hearing. They came toward it from Almena after cutting down Troy, making their way through the riotous overgrowth of abandoned lawns overrun by sumac and some long-dead rich idiot's ornamental dropseed run rampant. The long feathery blades made a shushing sound against their legs as they waded through the last stretch of the neighborhood. A ghost quarter, except for a few oddball holdouts Fran was sure were watching them from behind iron bars and blackout curtains. The house sat between a paved-over vacant lot and a rocky kind of hill where a rich family, the Shaws, had built a very modern and now abandoned pile of glass and concrete in the 1750s. Indy's house was old, probably 150 years or more, a big Victorian painted a peeling weathered white, its roof shedding shingles, its yard kept more or less manageable by a cover crop of hardy clover, though the raspberry bushes along the rotted-through north fence had begun to climb over it. Beth let Fran take her arm without a word when they were halfway across Indy's lawn. The taller girl listed heavily against her. There are armed turfs a minute from here, Fran thought, looking with unease at Beth's glassy stare and colorless lips. We'd never get away if they came now. She helped Beth up onto the sagging porch and glanced back at Robbie, who wouldn't meet her eyes. The fuck is wrong with him? She rapped smartly on the door. He couldn't get enough last night. The door creaked open a hair, then shut. Fran heard the chain rattling, and then Indy opened it, staring out at them. Her round face was ashen. Her thick black hair, shot through prematurely with gray, fell in disarray around her shoulders. Get inside, she snapped, stepping back from the doorway to let them shuffle one by one into the coat room. She was the fattest woman Fran had ever known, her upper arms like pillows, her belly hanging halfway to her dimpled knees in two thick, soft rolls clearly visible through her faded Cannibal Corpse t-shirt. Before Fran had pulled the door closed, Indy was inspecting Beth, matter-of-factly tugging the bloody bandage from her neck and ignoring the tall girl's yelp of protest as she probed at the puffy skin surrounding the sutures beneath. Fran shrugged the bow off of her shoulder and stood it by the door. She set the duffel down and touched the raw strip it had rubbed into her shoulder, wincing. Robbie followed her lead, setting down his pack and rifle. He looked nervous, almost skittish. Awful work, sniffed Indy, shooting Fran a look of mild reproach. She let the bandage fall to the dirty flagstones. You look terrible, and we have a lot to talk about. Follow me. She turned and led them up a single well-worn step into the house's cluttered dining room, her hips brushing softly against the door frame. She glanced back over her shoulder. Who's your friend? This is Robbie, said Fran, helping Beth mount to the step. The other girl's face had turned the color of drywall mud, a lifeless pasty gray. He saved us outside town. Robbie, this is our friend Indiresh. She processes our E. Indy brushed past Robbie's muttered greeting. Thank you for bringing my idiots back to me, she said briskly. Clear a seat and wait here. Read anything you like. Food in the kitchen. Indy's office was as clean as the rest of her house was a rat's nest. The windowless north wall lined with shelves of medical texts leather-bound volumes on endocrinology, fertility, and dentistry side by side with the water-damaged academic journals Fran had plundered from Harvard's medical library, the others occupied by glass-fronted cabinets stocked with surgical implements, rags, bottles, and bundled herbs, more of which hung from hooks in the ceiling. In the center of the room was an adjustable examination table, upholstered in stained beige leather. Together they guided Beth onto the table. The tall girl's last few steps were erratic, almost drunk, and for a moment Fran feared Beth would faint. But in the end they got her settled on her back. Her breathing was shallow, her skin waxy. "She has an assload of open wounds," said Fran, chewing her lip and hovering over Indy as she bent to inspect her patient. "The back of her right calf is the worst. I did what I could, but we were sitting in a pile of dead men when I patched her up. It wasn't exactly sterile." Indy was bent low over Beth's leg, keeping it propped up with a hand under the knee. "You're lucky I just skimmed a new penicillin from the tank. It looks like a good batch, too. Go to the cellar. Get me 400 milliliters of glass water, and a glass of water." "Sure," said Fran. As she stepped out of the office, shutting the door behind her, she heard Beth say something in a small, frightened voice. She sounded like a child. "They hurt me, Indy." And then Indy gently, "I know, baby. It's all right." Beth made a sound like a wounded animal, low and strained and desperate. Fran stared at the door for a while, wondering if she should go back in, if she should tell Beth everything that had gone through her mind when she'd watched her fall off the roof and into the arms of the men below. The words wouldn't come, and so she stood there, chewing on her lip, and listened to her friend's high, thin wails of grief. Beth sobbed in the soft circle of Indy's arms, her chest aching around a hard red knot of despair. The second she'd seen Indy in the door, she'd wanted nothing but to fall against her and dissolve into a screaming, drooling mess, to let the other woman's body absorb the pent-up misery of the last week. Her stapled leg itched so badly, it was all she could do not to claw at the infected skin. Everything hurt. It hurt to think. It hurt to breathe. "You need to hold still, baby," said Indy, pressing Beth back down onto the table. Her perfect fingernails traced the raised ridge of the crossbow wound along Beth's cheek. "I have to take these out and disinfect before I sew it up." The swab she pressed against the wound stank of hydrogen peroxide, a cutting, acid odor. Tiny scissors snipped next to Beth's ear, the one missing chunk where a man had bitten it off 4 years ago in the dead of winter. Indy drew the catgut out inch by careful inch until Beth could feel the lips of the wound sagging open around the half-scabbed gash. Her tongue probed at the inside of her cheek, feeling where the wound cut close to her mucous membrane. Another few millimeters, and it would have left her breathing through a second mouth. Hot tears rolled down her cheeks. She stared up at the ceiling of Indy's office, at the water stain by the darkened light fixture. The room was painted light blue. The ceiling was off-white. Daylight came in through the yellowing drapes. Indy scrubbed at the wound, and Beth held her breath and fought down the lump of bubbling misery at the back of her throat. A fierce stinging pain lit up her cheek as Indy cleaned the cut. It felt as though a swarm of wasps were stinging her along some fault line in her body, some appetizing orifice raw and tender enough to be preyed upon. She let out a muffled groan. "Hold still." Indy bent down close to Beth, her round face and double chin shining with perspiration, the fine black hairs on her upper lip just visible against her skin. She drew a yellowed Q-tip glistening with some kind of solvent quick along Beth's wound, then mopped at it with a folded rag. A moment later came the muted sting of the suture needle tugging at her cheek, in and out, hot, bright flashes of discomfort. The ceiling swam. She felt as though she were being pressed flat against the table by some massive hand, the air squeezed out of her lungs, her whole awareness slowing to a nauseous, muddy churn. For a while, Beth drifted in that gray-brown haze of pain, a headache building where the bridge of her nose crossed her eyeline. Indy removed her staples one by one and cleaned the gashes in her leg. Fran came in and made Beth drink something horribly bitter while Indy talked. Beth heard herself crying, flat and miserable, like a baby wailing from the bottom of a well. They lifted up her legs, taking one each, and Indy put a swab inside her. Everything hurt. The room tilted. It came apart. The men were waiting. And then it was dark outside, and Indy was beside her again, hips spilling from the edges of her rolling stool, glasses pushed up into her hair, and her nose buried in a book. Kerosene lamps burned in the gloom, casting flickering shadows on the walls and curtains. Indy looked up from her paperback as Beth swallowed. Her mouth was dry and cottony and tasted sour. Her head ached as though it might split down her nose and through her philtrum at any moment. "Indy, will you fuck me?" The other woman sighed, passing a hand over her face. She had little hands, plump and perfect like a baby doll's. You need to rest, honey. You're dehydrated. You have at least 2 broken ribs. You came within a quarter inch of losing your left hamstring. Beth slid a hand onto Indy's knee. Her arm felt as though it were weighted down with bars of lead. The other woman's skin was cool against her burning fingertips through the thin fabric of her skirt. Please? Bethany, no. The expression on the other woman's face told her this fell outside the needling push and pull of their occasional liaisons, the power games of her abjection and Indy's disdainful refusal. Beth letting her bruised dignity drop like a nightie to the floor. Indy pretending that she didn't want just that it was irrelevant to her that someone would approach her on their hands and knees, would beg without shame to touch the quivering hillsides of her body. Beth rolled toward her as best she could, clutching tighter at her thigh. Please. She knew how disgusting she sounded, but she couldn't stop. It poured out of her in a dirty flood of begging, even as Indy pushed her hand away, even as the other woman wordlessly held out another glass of sepia-colored diluted penicillin until Beth took it, slumping back onto the table. Drink this, then try to sleep. The door swung open, then shut hard enough to shake the framed diplomas on the wall. Beth stared up at the water spot, the glass forgotten in her hands. She began to cry in thick, snotty gasps that quickly sealed her nose and reduced each breath to a whining gurgle. Fuck me so I can pretend I'm a girl. Later, while Beth slept in her room upstairs, they sat together by candlelight at the hastily cleared kitchen table, eating cold pork and onions wrapped in thick brown flatbread. Fran had never tasted anything better in her life. Indy only picked at hers. She couldn't stand to be seen eating. Robbie, by contrast, wolfed his down without pausing for air. He was a loud chewer, which Fran decided to find endearing, but he still wouldn't say more than a few words at a time. They're all over town, said Indy as Robbie mopped tzatziki from his plate with the last of his bread. They got here the day before yesterday. They're in Boston, too, in Manchester, Nashua. Nobody's heard anything from Nashua on the ham since Wednesday. Fran sighed, looking out the dining room window at the overgrown hedge and the street beyond it. Farm workers were trickling back into town as the last of the daylight faded. A pair of weathered middle-aged women in faded Levi's, sunshirts, and work boots, one with a little girl clinging to her from behind, rode past on horseback, laughing about something as they went. Bees wandered through the lilac bushes in Indy's front yard. It all looked like it always did. We ran into them out by the coast, just across the Massachusetts border. Beth took a shot at Teach, the one who's supposed to be their den mother or whatever. She felt the phantom twinge of her desire for that woman, for the cold, bitter momminess of her, and tongued absently at the socket of her missing tooth. We barely got out alive. Indy looked troubled. She pushed her plate away, no longer bothering with even the pretense of eating. On his side of the table, Robbie was hunched defensively over his plate the way Beth sometimes did, a trait Fran had come to associate with people who'd grown up in big families. He'd taken his cap off and hung it on one of the chair's uprights. Indy's dining room chairs were metal and green vinyl, armless like all her furniture. How many of them were there? I don't know. They had 8, 9 trucks, ballpark maybe 500 people. Fran thought of the few other trans girls she knew who lived in Seabrook or who passed through it on the regular. She thought of Jenny Greenberg with her horsey face and tight, dark cornrows. She thought of Jenny's long arms and broad shoulders, and of Skinny Allie's Adam's apple that bobbed when she swallowed, and of Princess's perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. Maybe 1 in 4 of them could pass, and that number shrank to 0 if the turfs started pulling pants down. If they searched house to house, it would be, what, a bloodbath? Mass exile? How much power could they really have up there? I've been thinking, Fran said slowly. Maybe it's time we left. Whatever's going on here, it won't be good for us, so maybe we just go. Indy arched an eyebrow. I thought we could hitch to Concord, trade for a car there maybe. There's a commune in Oregon I heard about last time I was in Lowell. She felt unaccountably embarrassed, so she tried to speak faster. They have farms, solar, they'll always need doctors and hunters, or we could try for Montreal, it's far enough from Maryland. Indy laid a hand on hers. Francine, she said gently, I can't make that journey. I cannot travel 3,000 miles, and even if I could, there is no car in America running well enough to get me there, and no unbroken route to drive it on. Fran thought for a long time before she spoke again. It might start out hard, but wouldn't it get easier as we went? Her voice trembled. Like, wouldn't you get, used to it? Indy's expression closed. Her mouth was a thin line. Sophie Whittle made me an offer. Fran felt a stabbing, anxious pang of jealousy shot through with a hateful resentment of the older woman's body, of the way its soft and helpless bulk pinned them there to Seabrook when it would all be solved if they could just go. She imagined a dozen different things she could say, discarding each of them in turn as Indy held her gaze, and she wondered how much of what ran silently through her thoughts had already gone through Indy's, and if it had been gentler or crueler. I bet she hates herself in ways I can't even imagine. Robbie, looking up at last, spoke through a mouthful of pork and bread. The bunker brat? Indy nodded. She wants an in-house doctor, someone who knows how to isolate estrogen, cover primary care, and routine surgery. I was a fertility specialist before this, and I also understand she wants to be a mother, so... She shrugged. It would mean relocating to just outside Exeter, to the bunker. I've seen their hunting parties, Robbie said shortly. Lots of guns. He returned his attention to his wrap. There's a place for you and Beth if you want it. Indy was fiddling with the lace trim of the stained floral tablecloth. It had been her parents'. Fran knew, like most of the house's decor. I didn't mean to bury the lead. Fran sat there for a minute, listening to Robbie chew, trying to decipher the mixture of anxiety, anger, hope, and guilt in Indy's expression. When would we go? Tomorrow. She's sending a van. Whew. Afterward, Fran and Indy washed dishes while Robbie worked the pump in the kitchen sink. Beth had rigged it up as an apology after a nasty fight over something Fran couldn't remember. That had been years ago, right after they started working together, but Indy kept it oiled and it still moved smoothly. Fran tried not to let the play of the candlelight over Robbie's muscles distract her. He worked the pump with easy, fluid confidence, the same way he'd fucked her the night before, the same way his spit-slick's finger had slid in and out of her. Why was he so tongue-tied now? He didn't ask to sleep with her when they were through, the candles burning down to stubs of molten beeswax. He asked Indy if he could stay, and she said yes, of course, and showed him to one of the first-floor guest rooms. He didn't look at Fran before he left. For a moment she wanted to slap him, to drag him back into the kitchen and make him fuck her hard against the countertop, among the remains of supper, under the twine-wrapped bundles of herbs drying on the ceiling. In the living room, she curled up on the sagging, scratchy couch and waited there until Indy re-emerged from the back hall a few minutes later. The other woman sank into the ratty armchair opposite her, knees popping audibly, and let out a long, tired sigh. It was a small room, the furniture worn, the low coffee table scratched and splintering under its sedimentary layers of books. Peeling posters for the disgusting French movies Fran had never been able to sit through without getting nauseous stared down at them from the walls. Inside, trouble every day, eyes without a face. Indy heaved a sigh, settling back into the threadbare seat. So you slept with them? Fran nodded, tears welling in her eyes. There's beer from Jay and Dana under the sink. Go get two, will you? When she came back, Indy had her feet up on a little three-legged ottoman. They were as dainty as her hands, though swollen from a day spent standing. She took her beer and looked up piteously at Fran, batting her thick eyelashes. Rub my feet and I'll diagnose your boy problem. Fran sighed, lifting Indy's feet and sinking down into the ottoman before letting them drop back into her lap. A ripple ran through the other woman's body, which filled the chair's seat like pudding in a cup, and Fran made herself not stare. She knew it was wrong to look at Indy that way, to observe her like unseasonable weather or a strange but captivating painting. She dug her thumbs into the arch of her right foot, pressing as hard as she could. Indy exhaled, her rounded shoulders slumping. He's afraid of you. Fran looked up sharply. What? Keep rubbing. Indy waved a hand at her, then took a long sip of beer. She balanced the dark bottle atop the shelf of her belly, between where her breasts sloped to its sides. He's afraid of you, Francine. He's afraid to be close to anyone. You said you found him shooting men in the middle of the woods. Not exactly a group activity. How long do you think it's been since he touched another person? Fran blushed, still kneading the sole of Indy's foot. She bent down so that her hair would hide her burning cheeks. I didn't ask. I guess I figured. Yes, you figured. Indy leaned back against the chair's headrest, closing her eyes. You guessed. You assumed. You see what you want and where you'd like it to come from, not what's in front of your nose. If you want that boy to keep fucking you, if you want him to follow us out of here, you're going to need more than him feeling guilty for getting you and Beth stuck in the middle of a feeding frenzy. You're going to need to take care of him, at least a little, if he'll let you. She switched feet, feeling the muscles in Indy's arch spasm at her touch. I'm not moving too fast? Oh, honey. Indy settled deeper into the chair, shifting back and forth inside its confines. The world is over. Who cares how fast you go? He was halfway across the yard before she called his name, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the cool night air. Robbie. He turned. She stood by the moldering woodpile in nothing but a white satin nightie, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. Whirls of gray-blue smoke coiled around her in the moonlight as she exhaled and plucked the butt from her mouth, holding it out to him. He went to her and took it. The tobacco was stale, but it tasted like peat and fire on his tongue. He let the smoke trickle out slowly through his parted lips. "Are you leaving?" He nodded, not knowing what else to say. She took the cigarette back and took a drag. She smoked the way his mother had smoked, as though she were trying to get something from the cigarette she couldn't get in life. As she exhaled, she dropped the butt and ground it under her bare heel, and she stepped into his arms and kissed him. Smoke unfurled into his mouth from hers like a second tongue, hot and dry and aromatic. She murmured against his lips, "I don't want you to." The warmth of her body against his made him want to cry. It made him want to cling to her. It made him want to run until the smell of other humans was a memory he could take out in the long, dark emptiness of winter nights to hold in his cupped hands like Peter Pan held Tinker Bell. Something to be loved, but not the way you love another person. A toy, a bauble, a memory. You don't deserve this. Smoke boiling between their mouths as she drew back. Hot, hungry breath washing his cheek, his throat. She nipped at his shoulder and he caught his breath. She sank down to her knees in front of him as he dropped his pack and rifle, fumbling with the fly of his fatigues, his swollen clit stiff and hot against the metal. Her mouth, her hair between his fingers, crickets singing in the glass around them, and an owl somewhere crying out in the distance toward the ocean, the lights of the nuclear plant washing the undersides of dark clouds flowing over Seabrook. Beth woke to the sound of a voice crackling over the broadcast towers they'd seen coming into town. She thought about dragging the blankets up over her head, but it was warm out, and her inner thighs were already sticky with sweat. The thought of marinating in her own stink held little appeal. She rolled onto her side, kicking the linens to the footboard. The window was open a crack, the smell of lilacs wafting in on a sluggish breeze. She didn't remember climbing the stairs or falling asleep. Her entire body felt like one gigantic bruise. "Heard how many times that the world is over? I say the sex that poisoned the planet, stripped the oceans bare, and raped every woman it could get its hands on is dead, and good riddance to it. I say this is our time, that no longer will we mutilate our bodies to conform to arbitrary beauty standards. No longer will we sell our flesh to feed the misogynistic machinery of the porn industry. No longer will we be forced into whoring ourselves out to feed our children." She gripped the windowsill and pulled herself up, her ribs protesting, every breath bringing a fresh wave of sharp, stabbing pains. A crowd was gathering in the street, looking up at the broadcast towers, and the disembodied voice that thundered from them, static washed and overlapping. It was early. The light was pale, and birds perched by the hundreds on the rotting telephone poles and the eaves of houses. Children held their mothers' hands, little girls mostly, and a handful of boys born just before T-Day, no older than 5 or 6 now. In a few years, they'd be castrated or put on E, but their mothers still dutifully dressed them in blue and earth tones and junior fatigues, the last little kings of the world. "We will no longer be beaten. We will no longer be enslaved. We will no longer let the men who wear our identities and steal our history for their own sexual gratification dictate how we live and what we are allowed to believe. We will no longer let them prey on our daughters." A frisson of terror slithered up Beth's spine. She thought of every time a mother had stared sidelong at her on the commuter rail, every time someone had snatched their toddler away when she crouched down to say hello. She thought of her aunt's email to her mother explaining why her nephew was no longer welcome in her home around her children. "This is our world now. This is our America. Welcome, sisters, to the new Women's Commonwealth." Beth. She turned, scattered applause and cries of outrage and derision from outside ringing in her ears. Fran stood in the doorway. She had on one of her faded floral dresses, pale blue with a pink rose print, and she'd shaved her legs. She looked like a 50s housewife. "We have to go." They went down the stairs as fast as Beth could manage, Fran going sidelong with Beth's arm around her shoulder. She explained what was happening on the way, speaking tersely, her shoulder-length hair already lank with sweat. Beth couldn't think of any questions. Her leg hurt, her face, her ribs, her ass. The 100 tiny cuts and scratches on her thighs, her back, her shoulders. But more than any of that, as she limped through the kitchen and the dining room, out through the coat room and into the backyard where 3 sunburned women in jeans and t-shirts were loading boxes into a white van with rusted runners while Indy stood watching, she was afraid. It wasn't the few who'd cheered that frightened her. It was the rest, watching with guarded expressions, not looking at those among their number who cried, "Go back to Maryland, you fucking Nazis, and fuck TERFs." The women who looked at each other in a way Beth didn't understand, a way sealed forever within the cold and rigid bounds of cisness, but which nonetheless told her without room for doubt that they couldn't leave too soon. That was what scared her. The women who stayed silent. Hey, that's it. We finished part 1. Misandry. Amazing. We did it. We did it, gang. You said you think that voice should have sounded scarier. I assume you're talking about the loudspeaker voice, but I thought it would just sound like a lady, like a regular lady, Well, if anybody wants me to read anything else, I'll do it for $1 a page. Otherwise, I'm going to debut my furry book now. So I'll give it a minute. I'm going to play a pump up song. I see Ellen's going to bed. Probably other people going to bed too. It took a long time to read that. But I'm going to give people a moment to gear themselves up. Let me play a song here. What do I want? What's going to pump me up quick?
Bulging at the belly with my butt split, cup tits grip tightly when I come hit some rips. Do me while you do me after I'm sits. Hum this tune while you screw and go harder. Pop her body, little shorty like a martyr. Stop her water getting drippy like a faucet. Slap that ass at the moment she drops it. Blast that breath, sexy sex, I swear. Kiss on my neck, make a fist from my chest. Grip on your shaft, yeah, that dick's the best. Bounce with the balls till they soft.
Cosmic Blue, I've never heard of N.R. Mathis.
Kiss on my neck, make a fist from my chest. Grip on your shaft, yeah, that dick's the best. Bounce with the balls till they solve my stress. Solve my stress, solve my stress. Feel literally blessed that I get the best dick. Solve my stress, solve my stress. Let me just attest that I get the best dick. I lick, I suck, I fuck, I cup the balls and swallow. I'm a real tough back to follow. I can tort, distort, comport, and hold the fort. I'm not tall or short, but I'm small and warped. Walk around in tiny shorts when it's warm and excess tees. Skinny bitch, you can put my knees behind my head. Grind the springs off my bed, pack a huge cock in the back of my head, and solve my stress, solve my stress. Feel literally blessed that I get the best dick.
You can call it my furry arc or whatever, but like the only meaningful difference is like claiming furry as opposed to just like being obviously a furry. But I think I need to appeal to the furry audience more because I really do think the core of my audience. Will I do an audiobook for my web novel? Yes, I'm about to. That's what we're about to do. We're about to audiobook this right now. I'm just going to read this. And then later, I'm going to edit it and cut it into an audiobook. In fact, let me go ahead and make sure I'm recording in Audacity at the same time. Test. All right. As long as y'all can still hear me and that didn't like break my microphone or whatever. Okay, let's do this. Sunops, Rookie the Renegade's Reckoning, Book 1, Homelessness, Chapter 1. Midnight, after Rook's birthday. Freedom is the only thing I need. Coursing through my fur, freedom is the cool night wind and the stale summer humidity. Loud rumbling is the noise that freedom makes, crunching asphalt versus polyurethane wheels bearing screwed to the longboard that I call home. Push for push, I compel time to continue, the scenery to change. Wandering the city forever stretches before me, asking if I plan to stop anywhere before the end of the ride. It can't end, I beg. I'm not ready to stop. But every night my legs begin to wobble, start to lock up, and the time arrives when I have to lie down, whereupon time passes without account, and then I wake again, wondering how I got here. Homelessness Day 1, June 23rd, 2024, morning, 10:02 a.m. Rook Palmer was kicked out of his mother's apartment on the morning after his 18th birthday. I can't afford to have you here anymore, his tall and thin 55-year-old dog mother said, sitting in her pink bathrobe, hair turbaned in a pink towel, in front of the plated buttered toast slice that Rook had just set down for her on the table. When she finished her sentence, his paw that had just set the plate down swiftly lifted the toast and wholly slammed it between his cheeks to keep himself from shouting. A hob, he forced through the burial mound of bread, unable to maintain composure. But you spend all your money on that smoky stuff, she replied, seething with distaste. Rook, overcome with confrontational emotion, raced for the kitchen cabinets, rapidly producing a cup and then a pitcher from the fridge, filling one with water from the other, and then soaking the toast down his throat as quickly as possible so that he could retort. Tell me what you need for rent and I'll pay you, he begged, trying not to let his voice, that had started really booming with his blooming height in recent years, become a disturbance to the peace of surrounding apartments. You'll never be able to move out of here if all your money goes to that stuff, she argued. Mom, where do you expect me to go? Are you going to let me leave my things here? Rook was incredulous. He'd considered the possibility of being kicked out before, but not that she'd spring it on him on the first Saturday morning that she legally could. I don't know. You can come get your things when you find a place, I guess, she said, almost flippant about the situation, like she was telling him to rearrange the room and make space for a new couch. You guess? Awesome. Rook about-faced, unable to look at his mother anymore without losing his cool, and desperately afraid of worsening his situation further. He felt trapped in a lose-lose, unable to think of something to say that she wouldn't make an excuse for or try to throw back in his face like she'd always found a way to do. He knew he'd be better off figuring out what the hell to do next, which he feared would involve inconveniencing the few sane people in his family for help. You've got like $2,000, right? His mom continued speaking, while Rook stormed through the nearby doorway to his little room and started gathering his necessities. Plus, you've got your license now, so why not get a cheap car to live in like your dad? She asked. What the fuck do you think Dad's 2016 Prius V costs, Mom? Rook was just shy of shouting, using the full width of his diaphragm to reveal a voice with so much bass in it that it threatened to rattle the picture frames on the walls. Well, you can always start with a cheaper one and work your way up, she said, with the flippancy of a coworker trying to give someone romantic advice about a situation that they haven't been keeping up with. Yeah, if you see something with an engine and 4 tires for under $2,000 in the whole San Diego County, give me a call, Mom. Rook bit back while aggressively slinging an old strap-buckled pack onto his back and hurrying for the longboard by the door. You should be looking too, his mother hollered after him, somehow still oblivious to the fact that he'd been searching for cheap cars every single day on every app that listed them for months, just dying for the opportunity to hit the road and forget about his life in her shitty little apartment. He really hadn't wanted to have to live out of a backpack and on a longboard for any longer than a couple of days, but if that was the best he could do, then at least it was a lifestyle for which he'd been prepared. The sound of the front screen door being slammed into an exterior wall was the only reply his mother received, and Rook was out of her sight by the time its piston had brought it back to close. 10:10 a.m. From the vantage point of Rook's special spot in the sparsely forested mountain behind his Escondido neighborhood, his mother's apartment was fully visible, being no more than a city block away, which almost soured him from sitting there for a smoke, but spite for the reason that he'd been kicked out compelled him through 4 whole joints. He seethed, smoking and staring back at the apartment, mumbling all of the arguments he'd wanted to have with her under his breath, and wishing he'd not been so powerless to communicate with his hard-headed mother. Did you think you were going to convince me to stop smoking? He wondered, unable to fathom the logic he'd been presented with for his exile. Good luck with that. It's perfectly legal to smoke in total view of you. Rook's thinking continued spiraling edgily until he'd gotten high enough to think about something else for a second, and then to feel silly for trying to get his anger back when he remembered his situation. Whatever, he concluded, abandoning grief for the time being. I'm going to In-N-Out. 11:22 a.m. When the young stoner's mouth met the 4 layers of beef and cheese bulking his burger, he briefly forgot that he'd ever been upset about anything in his entire life. This taste had always been with him, of fresh-ish veggies, a barely seared onion, the signature mustard fried bun, combined condiments, and perfectly integrated cheesy beef. Only the number of patties and cheese slices had kept growing along with his height, which topped out at 6 feet 6 inches just 2 years ago. Meandering across the building's busy parking lot and toward the dumpsters in the lot's back corner, Rook's mind was lost in the sensory overload of a cow tsunami surging through his face. Moving his feet purely on instinct and thinking of nothing in particular, his intense hazel eyes beamed broadly beneath his thick, furrowed brow, always measuring the safety of his maneuvers while he wandered, burger in one fist and board in the other, until he settled at a thin strip of lawn behind the building, by the brick enclosure in which the dumpsters were kept. I wish I had a way to store meat. As the rapturous burger experience rapidly approached end, Rook only wished he could cook himself a second burger immediately. As much as he loved In-N-Out, he'd gotten great at grilling burgers in the park recently, and still had a pound of beef in the fridge at home and a half bag of charcoal on the back porch, which he planned to sneak back in for as soon as he could figure out where to transfer them to. He was sure that his mother hadn't considered how being unable to store food was going to cost him a fortune in ready-made meals. He hadn't bothered pointing out to her that most of his pot came free from his aunt's backyard. After all, he didn't want his mother and his dad's sister getting into unnecessary fights over him. He also thought that his aunt would be upset to learn that he couldn't keep his smoking a secret from his mother. Crumpling up the burger wrapper and angling for the dumpster, Rook fantasized about affording a $1,000 portable refrigerator, and then wondered if he could maintain a cooler full of ice hidden somewhere in the hills, until a glint of light from the ground caught his eye, just as he was shutting the dumpster lid. Sunlight had caught upon a crystal gem adorning a black, leather, fingerless, left-pawed glove, sitting flat on the pavement. Neat, Rook thought, immediately scooping up the garment to inspect it further, liking it, making sure it wasn't dirty, and then adorning it. Another glint of light caught the gemstone, and though it was only for a split second, Rook thought he saw a purple tint at the core of the clear crystal. The wind rose, tugging a bit at the loose parts of his tank top and short shorts, and cooling the beads of sweat that humidity had laced his fur with for only a moment. He admired how the glove actually fit his large paw and wasn't too hot to keep wearing. Didn't expect my first find to be a fashion statement, he thought, and dropped his board back to the street, ready to push off for another destination. 11:50 a.m. Rolling down the roadsides, Rook was also running through his mental contact list, ruminating on the advantages and disadvantages of running to someone for help. Whatever goodwill anyone had for him wasn't something he wanted to exhaust, but he also didn't want to spend any more time in limbo without a clear idea of what he was doing. Rounding corners with reckless speed, he rode with rage down lengthy stretches of downhill, edging his way out of Escondido, out from his sphere of influence. He ignored turns that would have taken him to houses of friends he'd graduated high school with just earlier that month, some with couches he could surely spend the night on. He passed houses of family members, aunts, grandparents, and older cousins in town that might have even put him up long term, knowing the way that his mother was and that he would have worked until he was on his feet. He passed the Arco gas station where he'd been working nights, his first job, which he'd only worked at for the boring last few months of high school, holding on to just a little bit of money which he hadn't spent on fun times with all of those aforementioned people. I'm ready to move on, he kept thinking. He didn't want to see recognizable scenery and faces anymore, to ride down roads that he knew too well, aware of exactly where he'd find himself at the end of them. If this world was full of all the possibilities that he thought it was, then he wanted to know what else was possible for him, something unpredictable, with a result that might change the way he saw himself. Riding in circles around the streets of Escondido, San Marcos, and Vista for the last 5 years, it had occurred to him plenty of times that he could make it very far if he just kept going in one direction as long as possible. Inland to Joshua Tree, north to Los Angeles, or south to San Diego, the latter to which he could probably make it before sundown. I bet the bay looks awesome on summer nights, he thought, and then he committed to the longest distance longboard ride of his life so far. 3:39 p.m. Alternately hiking with board in paw and skating where possible, Rook had followed the instruction of Google Maps on his now technologically ancient iPhone X down a hiking path which followed alongside Interstate 15 out of Escondido heading south, eventually veering west at Bernardo Village and up into the mountains. After 3 sweltering hours of almost constant movement under the beating sun, Rook was soaked with sweat as he pulled up panting, carrying his pack filled mostly with empty plastic bottles to the big open fields of Black Mountain Ranch Park. His trail intersected with the big park's walking loop. Joggers were glistening in the heat as they passed, while SUVs pulled in and out of the lot near the heart of the park facilities. The moment that he could tell which little building in the distance was probably the bathroom, he made a beeline for it. After a desperately relieving piss, he stood at the fountain outside of the bathroom and filled one of his water bottles, then sucked it down in several seconds, 5 times in a row, before filling the rest of his bottles while still gasping desperately from his body trying to distribute water back into his limbs. What the hell am I doing? Rook had kept putting this thought out of mind, letting his body continue against its better interest to guide him further from home. He'd never been to this park before, although its dry hills, sparsely littered with chaparral and sage plants, hardly seemed different from any other Southern California mountains. South of him across the parking lot, 4 baseball diamonds were situated all back to back, with a small building in the center of the circle they formed, all of them completely out of use. Just north of the bathroom stood 6 tennis courts, on which pairs of players were practicing doubles matches. As Rook was loading the last refilled water bottle into his bag, a glint of light reflecting off of the gem on his glove caught the attention of someone sending back a serve nearby, who then considered how they were going to approach the sweaty, long-haired skater. Aces Malone was a big cat, 6'2" and thick with muscles. He'd been known to go after balls with unparalleled energy, his whole body pouncing cross-court, rocketing high-speed lobs over the net, which he struggled to keep inside the boundaries of the court's deuce side. Everyone called him intense. The only thing humbling him was his desire to learn from his mistakes and improve, but losing matches made him so upset that he often stormed off into the woods alone to thrash at trees until he was calm enough to come back and crash out. His bright orange, black-striped coat kept him visible at a distance, but when he wanted to, he could also be impressively slinky. "Bathroom," he growled, just lowly enough that his panther doubles partner could hear him. The black-coated cat signaled for a break to the opponent pair, and then all 3 cats happily gathered to pant in the shade off court, while Aces scooped up his strap bag and quickly cut a circle around the backside of the bathrooms, stalking the foreign dog. "I've never seen this guy," Aces thought, intently staring from around the small building's corner. His golden-furred target didn't seem to detect him. It was some tall, skinny, long-haired dog who looked to be about his age, but definitely wasn't from his school. The dog was carrying a longboard that he must have rode in on, and he looked filthy, with a beaten old black pouch on his back overstuffed with plastic bottles, and looking so lost in thought that he'd forgotten the existence of other animals. Aces couldn't figure out why this guy was wearing an operator glove, but a couple of things were obvious. Firstly, that he probably didn't know how to use it, and secondly, that he definitely wasn't a part of the Malone family. Whatever this dog's story might have been, the appearance of a potential operator from another family so deep into the core of Malone family turf was a matter of incident to Aces. Unable to contain his curiosity, he drew a lot of air into his chest and started his way over to the dog. "Why do you have that?" Aces boomed in the biggest voice his barrel chest could produce as he closed in on Rook. Rook expressed no surprise, but simply turned to face the big cat, metering the fierceness of his reaction to avoid confrontation, even though he was sensing aggressive intentions from his questioner. "I found it by an In-N-Out dumpster in Escondido this morning," he explained calmly, but while revealing that his voice could easily drop even lower than his accusers. He continued, "Why? Do you know what it is? It looks like a crystal, but I can't tell if it's real." Truthfully, Rook had been curious about the glove all day, glancing at it periodically to see if it would show him that glint of purple light again. "Take it off," Aces demanded, completely ignoring the dog's line of questioning. Rook tensed up at the command, adrenaline surging into his body as he realized that he might be about to get into a fight. No, Rook said, in the most deflating tone he could muster, now hoping to avoid setting off this unhinged individual's anger any further. You don't know what that is, Aces said, insistently pointing at the glove with his bulging right arm. Yeah, I just said that, Rook replied, kind of astonished by how stupid this cat seemed. You shouldn't have that, Aces growled, clearly pissed. If he needed to find another way to tell this dumb dog to give over the glove, it was going to come to blows. Well, I do, so tough. Rook didn't want to swear, but he wasn't going to listen to this tough guy talk without a damn good explanation for why he should obey. Besides, nobody shorter than Rook could ever really scare him anyways, no matter how muscular they might look by comparison. All right, bitch, you want to do this the hard way? Aces asked, while tensing up and closing the already small gap between them, really getting his nipples up by Rook's chest like he wanted to rub down. Ugh, one of these guys, Rook thought, rolling his mind's eye at the use of the word bitch as an insult. Whenever a jock went for a stud's feelings, they always pulled that card, especially on a big dog like him. Since Rook identified as gender fluid, he would often joke with his friends that he was half bitch anyways, but he wasn't going to start that conversation with this closeted homosexual that he was coming to really hate. I'll show you something hard, Rook said, looking right down into the tiger's equally wild eyes, no longer remotely trying to avoid confrontation as emotion took control. Aces took this response poorly. His fury rose too quickly to swing at the dog while standing so close to him, and so instead, with a roar, Aces thrust his chest forward in a short-range body slam, blowing the stud back a step, but not off balance. Strangely, Rook felt a smile spreading wildly over his face. He hated having to fight, but if he was going to be pushed into it, then by Jove, he was going to enjoy it. With speed that Aces didn't anticipate, Rook's balled-up paw shot for Ace's face, and so Aces flinched back, but Rook stopped shorter than where Ace's face would have been, outstretched his paw, and then booped Ace's nose. Aces was entirely stunned, unable to even process the level of insult that he should feel about this attack, mostly on his masculinity. In the second, while Aces stood gormlessly with his mouth ajar, Rook flat-out bitch-slapped him square in the cheek with head-turning force, shifting the tiger's balance. Aces was fuming, so angry that he just blindly charged forward until an actual punch rocked him from the left, this strike putting him all the way off balance and staggering him back. Rook didn't pursue, feeling already satisfied that he'd expressed his superior fighting skills and hoping that Aces would take this opportunity to stop trying his patience. Aces did not. You want to know what the glove does? Aces shouted, regaining composure as he reached into his strap bag and rapidly equipped a nearly identical left-pawed jeweled glove to Rook's. Now we're getting somewhere, Rook thought, having hoped that this guy really did know as much about the glove as he seemed to. Rook had never considered that the glove did something, but now he was dying to know what it was. Aces started mumbling while holding his left arm outstretched at his side and tensing it up like he was trying to channel all of his energy into his paw. After a second, the gem on his glove began to faintly glow blue, and the air swirled visibly in front of his open paw. Aces was drawing in moisture from the atmosphere nearby and crystallizing it into a ball of ice, which from Rook's perspective looked just like a snowball was rolling itself up inside of the tiger's paw. It occurred to Rook that this cat before him seemed to be freezing the sweltering summer air, and then he realized that Aces was showing no signs of sweating, in spite of probably having practiced tennis in the summer heat all day. It became clear to Rook that he really needed to know how to use that crystal. Aces had maintained a death grip on the racket in his right paw. He clearly didn't intend on damaging it, and so Rook hadn't felt threatened by its presence. But as Aces finished materializing a tennis-sized ball of ice into his gloved paw and arched into a serving pose, Rook tensed up defensively. "Serve!" Aces shouted, leaping into the air with his specially crafted racket and full force firing the ice ball at Rook like a bullet. The dog dove to dodge, but he wasn't quick enough. Ace's ice ball was faster than expected, and it hurt a lot more than expected also when it crashed into the shallow part of Rook's shoulder. Rook gasped, blown backward almost off of his feet, and winced with searing pain as the hyperdense frost ball fell from impact, but he caught it by instinct on its way groundward and immediately pitched it back at Aces. "Idiot!" Aces boomed, ecstatically leaping for the for the high-speed pitch with his racket outstretched, and he pounded the ball back into the space that he knew his opponent should be moving into, but he failed to anticipate Rook's angle of attack. Rook's longboard was careening at him edgewise. It cut clean through the ice bullet, sending its halves off in either direction past Rook's head before clobbering Ace's in the side of his. Ace's crumpled straight to the ground, almost unconscious, and in so much pain that the world seemed to pause from his perspective. "You're the one who brought out the weapons," Rook said, unsympathetically stepping over the big cat so that he could grab him by the collar of his shirt. He took the tiger, trying to bring the cat's eyes... No, he shook the tiger, trying to bring the cat's eyes back into focus, and bellowed at him. "Tell me how to use the glove." "Go." Aces realized that he couldn't finish his insult through the reeling pain. Unsatisfied with this reply, Rook punched Aces in the face and dropped him back onto the concrete. "Do you want your girl to see your face all messed up tonight, or do you want to tell me how you're keeping cold in this god-awful heat?" Rook had lost his patience with this cat. He was sure that he could pound this fool to death if he needed to, and also that it wouldn't be necessary. He just hoped the guy would start answering his frustrations before he found himself spitting teeth. "You really aren't with one of the families?" Aces asked, scooting back into his hands and trying to prop himself up so that he might get to his feet, but his legs were wobbling too hard to support his hefty upper body. "Who the hell are you?" Aces had lost fights before, but never to someone that didn't even know how to use an op glove. "Rook, I'm just a renegade dog from San Marcos. I found the glove by the In-N-Out dumpster in Esco, like I said. If this thing can really cool my fur, it might keep me alive this summer, so I can't let you leave without letting me in on this thing's secret." Rook knew that he must be asking for something serious, since whatever this magic or technology was, it clearly wasn't being shared publicly. These families sounded incredibly dangerous to him. "If you can really use an op glove, then you should have seen a core color when you put it on," Aces explained, pushing his body up into an Indian-style seat and gripping his ringing skull with both paws. "Purple," Rook replied. "I saw purple." "Purple? That's rare. What family has purple?" Aces trailed off, thinking out loud because there was hardly space for anything inside his head besides pain. "Like you said, I don't know anything about these families. Do I need to be in one to use the glove?" Rook understood that Aces was probably still reeling, but he really wanted to start cooling himself off. "No, but you'll never learn any codes without joining one," Aces explained, feeling a jolt of pain through the side of his head as a result of speaking, and thinking that getting in the head with a longboard hurts a lot more than he ever realized it would. "I bet you can teach me one," Rook said, with no intention of letting go until this damn cat got him frosty. "Ugh. Cats don't usually just get this stuff in one go, you know. Operating requires that you know the operation code and also that your body understands what you mean with it," Aces said. He felt stupid trying to boil the vagary of operator abilities down into a couple of pithy sentences, but he also was desperate for this interaction to end before his weaker but very proud friends noticed that he was on the ground and came over to get their asses kicked by this dog as well. "Well, I'm not a cat, and just now I saw what you were doing already, so how about telling me that operation code?" Rook felt like the mechanics of this magic couldn't possibly be too complicated for him to figure out if this awkwardly spoken jock could do it. "Cumulogathering. That's the category of cooling operations I've been using. Basically, it's just pushing the wind around a little bit, gathering moisture from the air and cooling it hyper quickly," Aces said. "Ventilatorio is the code to run a constant breeze over your body like a car AC. Cumulogatherum is the generic code for gathering moisture into a single point. I can get it about as big as a tennis ball, and that's pretty much my limit." Aces sounded especially defeated at the end of his explanation, his adrenaline having fully faded and the depth of his defeat totally having sunken in. Rook realized from the tone of his explanation that Aces was admitting to being only a novice operator himself, and that he'd probably already shown off everything he could do within this encounter. It had been such a pathetic showing that Rook almost felt guilty for hurting the dude so badly. "I'm not sorry about defending myself, but thank you for teaching me about the op glove," Rook said. "My mom kicked me out of her apartment this morning, so I'm not in a very good mood, but if I can make this thing work, then I'll be a lot less pissed." "Whatever," the cat spat back spitefully. "You should skate before my friends try to fight you." You're right, Rook agreed. I'm trying to make it to San Diego before nightfall. Later, big cat. Rook dropped his board, boarded, and boarded. San Diego? By longboard? Aces remained stunned. The sound of hard polyurethane rolling against asphalt filled the air as a fighter whom Aces wished he'd never challenged rode out of the park. Aces realized while stumbling to his feet at last that there was probably a big red mark across his face, which he was going to have to explain to the litter in a moment. What's that guy's deal? Some kind of maniac? Aces trudged emptily over to his friends, who were still panting in the shade of a tree on the other side of the bathroom building. 4:20 p.m. Although Rook had hurried from the park, wishing only to be away from his feline assailant, he also didn't travel much into the ungroomed mountains before stopping again to solve those operator codes he'd just been taught about, and also to light up another joint. Once the adrenaline rush had passed, he'd remembered the dull throbbing pain in his shoulder from getting pelted by the ice ball, and so his lust for adventure was waning in favor of a wish for comfort. Like a car AC. Rook thought about the way that the air would rush over his fur from the AC in his dad's Prius V. Remembering that soothing chill, he whispered, "Ventilatorio." And, like his imagination had been made real, he felt the breeze begin to blow over him, cooling the thousands of sweat beads all strewn throughout his fur. Oh my God. Yes! Yes! 18 years of suffering Southern California summers, and it had never occurred to Rook to turn the air into a personal cooling system. This is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me, he thought ecstatically. I owe that dumbass money. It seemed impossible that the operation was so easy to use, but there was no question of the constant breeze cooling his fur from all sides. An even more pressing question next entered his mind. Can I cool my beef with this operation? As much as he wanted to see San Diego that night, and as much as he didn't want to chance an encounter with his mother, he also really didn't want the pound of beef and 2 pounds of charcoal he'd left behind at the apartment to go to waste. Now that he wouldn't be dying of heat exhaustion for the whole way, the prospect of making a trip back to the apartment didn't seem so daunting. He would also know the best places to sleep in the hills behind his former home, and he could then make the whole 9-hour ride to San Diego starting from earlier in the morning. Plus, he would get the next 3 hours of backtracking to figure out what else this magic could do. God damn it, he thought, reboarding the path he'd hiked in on. I'm really going to have to sneak in quietly or that bitch might call the cops. And there you go. That's the first chapter of Sunops, Rookie the Renegade's Reckoning, or SO3R, Book 1, Homelessness, Chapter 1. Oh, I don't know how long it'll take me to write another chapter of this. This took most of the last 2 days. Most of today I spent writing the bulk of this. So, I can write it fairly fast, but not that fast. So we'll see what happens. It also depends on if people like this, if people think this is cool. Again, I will cut this into a proper audio book tomorrow and release it to the channel by itself. I'll go ahead and tell you all one spoiler. The reason that the book is called Rookie is that Rook Palmer, his middle initial is E. His middle name is Emerson. His name is Rook Emerson Palmer. His dad's a big Emerson, Lake and Palmer fan. His sister's name is Lake. And somebody's going to find that out at some point and start calling him Rookie because his name is literally Rook E. Palmer. Anyway, that's that. Hope you all enjoyed this. I'm going to go piss and pass out now. Thanks for coming out. See you tomorrow.